I'll be back in an hour, babe. Meeting with the boss, Lisa said, grabbing her purse and keys from the kitchen counter. She glanced at her phone, her finger hovering over a message notification, but quickly swiped it away. Randy, her husband, sat across from her at the dining table, nursing his morning coffee. He looked up from his laptop, raising an eyebrow. Another meeting with George? You've been working late a lot lately, he said, his tone more curious than accusatory. Lisa shrugged, pulling her jacket over her shoulders. It's the busy season, you know. George has got us all running around like crazy. Randy took a sip of his coffee, watching her carefully. Just don't burn yourself out, okay? We're still on for this weekend, right? His voice was hopeful, filled with anticipation for the romantic weekend getaway he had secretly planned. Lisa's smile faltered for a split second. Then she quickly forced it back. Of course, I wouldn't miss it for the world, she replied, but her eyes flicked to her phone again as another message from George buzzed through. She reached for it, pausing. Gotta go, see you later. She kissed Randy quickly on the cheek, and before he could respond, she was out the door. Randy stared at the closed door for a moment, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest. Something wasn't right. He shook off the thought, turning back to his laptop. He had spent weeks planning this weekend trip, hoping it would be the spark they needed. Maybe he was just imagining things. Lisa, meanwhile, climbed into her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she unlocked her phone. The message from George glared up at her. Can't wait to see you. Same place. She hesitated for a moment, biting her lip, then quickly typed back. Leaving now. Be there in 20. She tossed her phone on the passenger seat and started the engine, her heart racing. Not from excitement, but from guilt. She glanced at her wedding ring, twisting it absent-mindedly before driving off. Back at the house, Randy was closing his laptop, thinking about the weekend. He had booked a cozy cabin in the mountains, something quiet and away from the city. The kind of place where they could reconnect. They needed this, he needed this. Things between them hadn't been the same for months. Lisa was always busy with work, always distracted. They barely talked anymore. He stood up and started clearing the breakfast dishes, his mind wandering back to Lisa's rushed goodbye. It wasn't the first time she'd seemed distant, but he told himself it was just work stress. After all, Lisa had always been driven, even when they first met. But lately, he wasn't so sure. As he rinsed off the plates, his phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from his buddy Tom. Tom, hey man, still good for lunch later? I have something to tell you about work. Randy quickly texted back. Yeah, see you at 1. He put his phone down, then stood there for a moment, staring at the kitchen window. His reflection looked tired, worn out. He hadn't noticed how much this tension with Lisa was affecting him until now. He was working harder than ever to make things right, to reignite what they had, but it felt like something was slipping through his fingers. Lisa pulled into a parking lot behind an office building, far away from her own office. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was George calling. She hesitated, then answered. Hey, handsome, she said, her voice low. Hey, sexy, George replied. You here yet? Just parked. I'll be in soon, she said, hanging up quickly. She stared at the steering wheel for a moment, her chest tight. She knew she shouldn't be doing this. Guilt gnawed at her, but she shoved it down. She convinced herself that Randy would never find out. He trusted her. As she stepped out of the car, she checked her reflection in the side mirror, adjusting her hair and makeup. She took a deep breath, then headed inside the building, where George was waiting. The door closed behind her, shutting out the world she was trying so hard to escape. Back at home, Randy finished cleaning up the kitchen and sat back down at the table, his thoughts swirling. He had done everything right, planned the perfect weekend, supported Lisa's career, been patient through the rough patches. But something in the pit of his stomach told him that maybe his efforts weren't enough anymore. He looked at the clock. Lisa would be back soon, and maybe, just maybe, this weekend would fix everything. As Friday rolled around, Lisa sat at her desk at work, her phone lighting up with messages. She glanced around, ensuring no one was watching before opening the latest text from George. George, room's booked. Can't wait to see you. She felt a thrill, but it was mixed with guilt. She hadn't told Randy anything about this weekend, just a vague mention of being busy at work. He had mentioned something about a surprise, but she pushed it to the back of her mind. Right now, her focus was on George. At home, Randy was finishing the final touches on his surprise getaway. He had rented a cabin just outside the city, deep in the woods. It was the perfect place to reconnect with Lisa. He imagined her smiling when he told her, her excitement about spending the weekend away together. She needs this, Randy muttered to himself as he packed the last of the wine bottles into a cooler. He looked around the kitchen, making sure he hadn't forgotten anything. The candles were packed, the dinner ingredients ready, and all he needed now was Lisa. Meanwhile, Lisa was already miles away from home. She and George had agreed to meet at a secluded hotel just outside the city. As she pulled into the parking lot, her heart pounded, a mix of nerves and excitement. She parked her car and glanced at her phone, her finger hovering over Randy's name in her contacts. "Should I call him?" she whispered to herself. But the thought was fleeting. She quickly put her phone away and stepped out of the car. George was waiting at the entrance, a smug grin on his face as he saw her. "You made it," he said, walking toward her. Lisa forced a smile. "Of course I did," she replied, her voice a little shaky. George reached for her hand, pulling her closer. "God, you look stunning," he murmured, his eyes roaming over her. He leaned in, brushing his lips against hers. Lisa hesitated for a second, but quickly gave in, feeling the rush of adrenaline. "You're bad for me," she whispered into his ear, her breath shaky. George laughed softly, tightening his grip around her waist. "Maybe, but you like it," he replied, leading her into the hotel. They checked in quickly, the receptionist barely glancing at them as they headed upstairs to their room. Once inside, George pulled Lisa into his arms again, kissing her deeply. She responded, her thoughts of Randy fading as they became consumed by their affair. Back at the house, Randy was putting the finishing touches on dinner. The table was set with candles, their favorite wine was chilling, and soft music played in the background. He glanced at the clock. Lisa was supposed to be home by now. Maybe she got held up at work, he thought, but a nagging feeling began to creep into his mind. He decided to text her. "Randy, hey, just checking in. Everything okay?" Minutes passed, and there was no response. He tried to push the unease away, telling himself it was just work. She'd come home soon, and they would head off for their romantic weekend. But as the hours ticked by, doubts started to settle in. Lisa, meanwhile, was lying in bed next to George, their clothes scattered across the floor. She glanced at her phone, seeing Randy's message, but ignored it. Instead, she rolled over to face George, who was watching her with a satisfied grin. "What's that look for?" she asked, her tone playful but edged with nervousness. "Just thinking how lucky I am," George replied, running his hand through her hair. "You could be anywhere right now, but you're here. With me." Lisa laughed softly. "Don't get too full of yourself," she teased, but the guilt was there, gnawing at her. She tried to push it away, focusing on the thrill of the moment. "I shouldn't be here," she said quietly, more to herself than to George. George leaned in, kissing her neck. "But you are," he whispered, "and that's all that matters." Lisa closed her eyes, trying to drown out the nagging voice in the back of her mind. She knew this was wrong, but the excitement, the escape, it was intoxicating. She could worry about everything else later. Back home, Randy sat at the table, staring at the untouched dinner. His phone lay next to him, still without a response from Lisa. He sighed, feeling the weight of disappointment settle in his chest. The excitement for the weekend had turned into a hollow ache. "Maybe tomorrow," he whispered to himself. But as the night dragged on, the thought of where Lisa might be haunted him. Something wasn't right. It was late Sunday afternoon when Randy walked through the front door, a bottle of wine in one hand and a small bouquet of flowers in the other. He smiled to himself, imagining Lisa's reaction. He had prepared everything for their getaway, despite her silence over the weekend. She'd been distant, sure, but maybe she just needed space. The house was eerily quiet. Randy glanced at the clock, 6:00 p.m. Lisa had promised she'd be back by now. His smile faded as he placed the wine on the counter and pulled out his phone. No new messages. Randy wandered into the living room, looking at his phone, debating whether to call her. "She's probably just running late," he muttered, trying to reassure himself. He settled onto the couch, flipping through TV channels absent-mindedly, his eyes darting to the door every few minutes. An hour passed, then 2. Still no word from Lisa. The pit in Randy's stomach grew heavier. He sent her a quick message. "Randy, hey, everything okay? Let me know when you're on your way." Another hour. Nothing. At 9 p.m., his phone buzzed. Relief washed over him as he snatched it up, thinking it was Lisa. But the message wasn't from her. It was from his friend, Tom, who worked in the same office as Lisa. "Tom, Randy, you need to see this." Randy's fingers hesitated before tapping the notification. The message opened to reveal a single photo. At first, he couldn't process it. It showed Lisa in a hotel lobby, her arms wrapped around a man Randy recognized immediately, George, her boss. They were kissing. Randy's breath caught in his throat. His vision blurred as he stared at the screen, his mind trying to reject what his eyes were seeing. He zoomed in, hoping, praying it wasn't real. But there was no denying it. The timestamp showed it was from that very weekend. His hands shook as he set the phone down on the table. For a moment, he just sat there, motionless, staring at the wall. A wave of emotions crashed over him. Confusion, hurt, anger, all swirling together until he could barely think straight. "Why?" he whispered, his voice barely audible in the empty room. He picked up his phone again, scrolling through the messages Lisa had sent him over the past week. Suddenly, all the late nights, the vague excuses, the distant tone in her voice made sense. She'd been with George. All those nights, she said she was at work. She'd been with him. Randy clenched his fists, feeling the anger rise like a fire in his chest. He stood up abruptly, pacing around the living room. His thoughts were racing, bouncing between disbelief and rage. How could she do this? After everything they'd been through, after everything he'd done for her? His mind flashed to the weekend he had planned for them. The hours he spent preparing, thinking they could fix things. He'd been working so hard to make their marriage work. And the whole time, she was betraying him. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Tom. "Tom, I'm sorry, man. I didn't know how to tell you, but I thought you should see it before things got worse." Randy's jaw tightened as he typed a response. "Randy, thanks for letting me know. Don't worry about it." He tossed the phone onto the couch and stormed into the kitchen, grabbing the bottle of wine. He yanked out the cork and poured himself a glass, downing it in one go. It didn't help. The fury inside him was growing, burning hotter with every passing second. "I'll make them both regret this," Randy muttered to himself, gripping the edge of the counter until his knuckles turned white. He wasn't going to let this go. He wasn't going to let them walk all over him. He slammed the empty glass down and paced around the kitchen, his mind spinning with thoughts of revenge. Lisa had broken their vows. She had betrayed him in the worst way possible. And George? That smug bastard had taken what wasn't his. They both needed to pay. Randy glanced at his phone again, the image of Lisa with George still fresh in his mind. He pulled up his contacts and hovered over Lisa's name, but he didn't call. Not yet. No, he had to be smart about this. He couldn't let his anger drive him into making a mistake. He sat down at the table, tapping his fingers against the wood. He needed a plan, something that would hurt them both as much as they had hurt him, something that would make them wish they had never crossed him. Randy's eyes narrowed as an idea started to form in his mind. He wasn't going to confront Lisa tonight. No, that would be too easy. He was going to wait, gather everything he needed, and then he'd strike. With his mind made up, Randy leaned back in his chair, a dark determination settling over him. "Let's see how they like being blindsided," he whispered to himself, his lips curling into a grim smile. That night, Randy lay in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind churned, replaying the image of Lisa and George over and over again. Confronting her immediately felt like the natural reaction, but that would be too simple, too quick. No, he needed something more, something that would destroy both of them in a way they could never recover from. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. He didn't bother checking it. It was probably Lisa, offering more lies to cover her tracks. Instead, he sat up, his heart pounding as an idea began to form. The first step was to gather as much evidence as possible. If he was going to do this right, he needed everything. The next morning, Randy sat at his computer, a cup of cold coffee next to him, eyes glued to the screen. He wasn't a tech expert, but he knew enough about Lisa's habits. She was careless with her passwords, often using the same one for everything. With a few guesses and a lot of persistence, he managed to get into her email account, and from there, her phone's cloud backup. What he found made his stomach turn. There were months of messages between Lisa and George. Long, intimate conversations, declarations of love, and plans for future weekends together. He scrolled through the texts, his hands shaking, reading every word, even though it felt like a knife twisting deeper into his chest. Then the pictures, explicit photos she had sent George along with videos. Randy stared at the screen, his anger boiling beneath the surface. He wanted to throw the laptop across the room, scream, do something. But instead, he took a deep breath. He needed to stay calm. There was no use losing control now. Randy started methodically downloading everything. The texts, the pictures, the videos. He created folders, organizing each piece of evidence with precision. This wasn't just about his personal revenge. He was going to destroy them, not just emotionally, but professionally and socially. Once he had all the evidence stored on his hard drive, he began thinking about how to release it. Confronting Lisa privately wouldn't be enough. She had to feel humiliated in front of the world. And George's downfall would be even more satisfying. He opened his phone and searched for George's social media profiles. LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, they were all public. George was a well-respected man in the industry, a senior manager at the company where Lisa worked. He had a spotless professional reputation. Randy smirked. Not for long. That night, while Lisa texted from work, Randy began creating anonymous accounts. He signed up for multiple email services, setting each one with different names, untraceable back to him. He created a burner phone number, just in case, using an app that masked his real number. It was all coming together. The next step was timing. He didn't want to launch the attack too early. He needed to make sure everything was in place, that there was no escape for either of them. He planned to release the material slowly, letting the pressure build until it exploded. Randy knew Lisa and George often had company meetings on Fridays. That would be his moment. He'd send the first wave of evidence directly to George's higher-ups, exposing the affair in a way that would tarnish both their reputations. From there, he'd leak the more personal photos and videos, ensuring maximum damage to their personal lives. As he sat back, staring at his laptop, a sense of satisfaction washed over him. He could already picture the look on Lisa's face when she realized what was happening. She wouldn't just lose her marriage, she'd lose her job, her social standing, everything. And George? He'd be lucky to get a job flipping burgers after this. Randy knew there was no going back from this. Once he set the plan in motion, it would be like lighting a fuse. The explosion would destroy everything. But he didn't care anymore. They had betrayed him in the worst way possible, and they deserved whatever came next. By the time the sun came up, Randy had everything ready. The evidence, the burner accounts, the messages he would send, it was all prepared. He felt a strange sense of calm, like the storm inside him had settled. Lisa came home that morning, looking tired, offering him a quick kiss on the cheek before heading to the shower. Randy watched her, feeling nothing but coldness. "Enjoy it while you can," he whispered under his breath. "It's all coming down soon." It was Monday morning, and Lisa strolled into the office, oblivious to the storm waiting for her. She was in a good mood, still riding the high from the weekend she had spent with George. She casually greeted her coworkers, flashed her usual smile, and headed towards her desk. As she rounded the corner, everything changed. Her heart stopped. There, hanging from the ceiling above her desk, was a massive banner. The bold, black letters screamed at her from across the room. "Cheaters get caught." Lisa's breath caught in her throat as her eyes drifted downward to the giant poster beneath the banner. It was an explicit photo of her with George, one that she knew very well. A photo she had sent him in private. Her world crumbled in an instant. Her legs wobbled as she stumbled forward, frozen in place for a second. Whispers echoed around the office as her co-workers stared at the spectacle. The once busy chatter in the room had fallen silent, and every set of eyes was fixed on her. Some looked shocked, others smirked, clearly relishing the drama unfolding before them. No, this can't be happening, Lisa muttered under her breath, panic rising in her chest. She lunged forward and started ripping the poster down with shaking hands, yanking at the corners of the paper. It tore unevenly, bits of the image still clinging to the wall as she fumbled with it. Her co-workers stood frozen for a moment, and then the murmurs grew louder. Someone snickered. Another person raised their phone, recording Lisa's frantic attempts to destroy the evidence. The humiliation hit her like a freight train, and the room seemed to close in around her. "Oh God, no," she whispered, feeling the heat of shame rise in her cheeks. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she ignored it. She was too focused on getting rid of the poster, but it was no use. The damage was done. People were whispering, texting, taking photos. Lisa yanked at the last remnants of the paper and threw it in the trash, but her hands were shaking so badly she could barely manage. Finally, she grabbed her phone and sprinted out of the office, not bothering to look back at the crowd of stunned faces behind her. She bolted into the stairwell, her heart racing, her mind spinning in 1,000 different directions. The walls seemed to close in on her as she frantically scrolled through her contacts. "George," she whispered, her voice trembling as she hit the call button. Her hands shook so violently that she almost dropped the phone. The ringing seemed to last forever before George finally picked up. "Lisa? What's going on?" George answered, his voice groggy from the early hour. "It's over, George," Lisa screamed into the phone, pacing up and down the narrow stairwell. "He knows. Everyone knows. There was a banner at work. Pictures, everything. Everyone saw it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. For a moment, Lisa thought George had hung up, but then she heard him curse under his breath. "Are you serious?" he hissed. "How did he? I don't know." Lisa cut him off, her voice rising in panic. "I don't know how he found out, but it's all over the office. People were recording it. What are we going to do?" George fell silent again. Lisa could hear him breathing, but there was no reassurance in his voice. I'll figure something out," he mumbled, but there was no confidence in his tone. "Figure something out?" Lisa echoed, her voice cracking. "There's nothing to figure out. We're screwed. Everyone knows, George." She started pacing faster, her hand gripping her phone tightly, as if it could somehow anchor her to reality. George sighed. "Let me think," he said, his voice strained. "I'll call you back." Lisa stared at the phone as the call ended, disbelief washing over her. Her stomach churned. She couldn't go back into the office. Not after that. She couldn't face the whispers, the looks, the rumors that would surely spread like wildfire. Her phone buzzed again, and this time, she saw an email from HR. Her heart sank. She opened it with trembling hands. It was a formal notice, summoning her to a meeting with management that afternoon. No details, but she knew what it was about. Her career was hanging by a thread, and it wouldn't be long before everything else followed. Frantically, she dialed her husband, but there was no answer. Lisa slumped down on the stairwell, her breath coming in shallow gasps as her world crumbled around her. Lisa sped down the street, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her mind was a chaotic swirl of fear and confusion. The banner, the photo, the stairs. Her career was crumbling. But right now, all she could think about was Randy. She needed to talk to him, to explain, to beg. She needed to fix this. As she pulled into the driveway, her stomach dropped. Her belongings, clothes, shoes, handbags, were scattered across the lawn. Dresses she had worn on special occasions were tossed carelessly on the grass. Her heels were sprawled out like forgotten debris, and her favorite coat was draped over a bush. But what caught her attention was the absence of the most valuable items. The expensive jewelry Randy had given her over the years, the diamond necklace from their anniversary, the gold bracelet from her birthday, all missing. "No, no, no," she whispered, stepping out of the car, her heart racing even faster now. She ran up to the front door, her heels sinking into the soft grass as she went. Reaching the door, she tried the handle. It was locked. Fumbling with her keys, she tried the first one. Nothing. She tried another. Still nothing. "Randy!" she screamed, her voice cracking as she pounded on the door. "Randy! Open the door. Her fists hammered against the wood, but there was no sound from inside. No footsteps. No movement. Just cold, eerie silence. She tried the door again, pressing her face to the glass window beside it, but the house looked untouched. Everything was in its place, as if she had just left it that morning. "Randy, please. Let me in," she shouted again, her voice growing more desperate. Still nothing. Lisa backed away from the door, panic surging through her. She ran to the side of the house, checking the windows. Locked. She tried the back door, but it wouldn't budge either. It was as if Randy had sealed her out, not just from the house, but from his life. She took a deep breath and pulled out her phone, dialing Randy's number. The call went straight to voicemail. She tried again, but it was the same. Her hands shook as she scrolled through her contacts, frantically searching for anyone who might be able to help. She tried her best friend, Alyssa, but no answer. She called Tom, her colleague, but the line rang endlessly. She dropped her phone to her side, staring at the house in disbelief. This couldn't be happening. She hadn't expected Randy to find out, let alone to react like this. She had thought she had more time to figure things out, to come up with some excuse, some way to fix it. But as she looked at the scattered remains of her life on the front lawn, it hit her. Randy had planned this. He had been preparing for her betrayal, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Her legs felt weak, and she sank down onto the steps in front of the door, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Tears welled up in her eyes as she whispered, "Randy, please." She wiped at her face, trying to compose herself, but it was no use. The realization of just how thoroughly Randy had planned his revenge washed over her. He hadn't just found out. He had orchestrated everything, publicly humiliating her at work, locking her out of their home, scattering her belongings like garbage. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment reaction. It was cold, calculated, and final. Lisa's phone buzzed in her hand. She looked down to see a message from an unknown number. Unknown. Enjoy the lawn. It's where cheating sluts belong. Her stomach twisted in knots as she read the message. Randy had thought of everything. She looked around again, taking in the sight of her life, once perfectly curated, now reduced to a pile of discarded belongings. She tried to calm herself, but the tears kept coming, her breaths turning into sobs as the weight of what she had done, what she had lost, began to settle in. A neighbor from across the street peeked out from their window, watching her meltdown unfold. Lisa quickly stood up, wiping her face again, trying to hold on to whatever shred of dignity she had left. "I'll fix this," she whispered to herself, but deep down, she knew there was no fixing it. Randy had shut her out, literally and figuratively. The locks were changed, and her life, as she knew it, was over. Her nightmare had only just begun. Lisa drove in silence, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she made her way to her mother's house. Her mind was racing, replaying the events of the day, the humiliation at work, the locked doors at home, the scattered belongings on the lawn. She didn't know what to say, how to explain any of this to her mother, but she had nowhere else to go. When she pulled into the driveway, her mother was already waiting at the door, concern etched across her face. Lisa stepped out of the car, her legs feeling shaky, and walked up to the house. "Lisa, honey, what's going on?" her mother asked, her voice filled with worry as she pulled her daughter into a hug. Lisa melted into her mother's arms, feeling a strange combination of shame and relief. For a moment, she just wanted to stay there, in the safety of her mother's embrace, and pretend everything was okay. "I don't even know where to start, Mom," Lisa whispered, her voice cracking as she pulled away. Her mother gave her a sympathetic look, but didn't press for details. Instead, she motioned towards the table in the hallway. "This came for you," she said, picking up a small package. "It's from Randy." Lisa's stomach dropped. "From Randy?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She reached out with trembling hands and took the package, feeling its weight like a stone in her chest. Her mother watched her, concerned. "Are you all right? What's going on, Lisa?" "I don't know," Lisa muttered, barely hearing her mother as her hands fumbled to tear open the strange package. Inside, she found a flash drive and a folded note. Her hands shook as she unfolded the paper, the words scrawled in Randy's familiar handwriting sending a chill down her spine. I hope it was worth it. Watch the drive. Lisa stared at the note, the words blurring as her heart pounded in her chest. She felt her mother's eyes on her, but she couldn't bring herself to explain. Instead, she walked to the living room and sat down in front of her laptop, her fingers clumsy as she plugged in the flash drive. Lisa, her mother called from the doorway. What is it? I don't know, Lisa whispered, barely hearing her own voice. The screen flickered to life, and Lisa's breath caught in her throat. One by one, the damning pieces of her affair with George flashed before her. Every text, every explicit photo, every intimate video. She felt her stomach twist in knots, her heart sinking lower with each new image. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice shaking as the screen filled with the undeniable evidence of her betrayal. The cold, hard proof of everything she had done. Her mother stood behind her, silent, watching the screen in disbelief as it continued to play. "Lisa," she started, but the words trailed off, lost in the gravity of what they were seeing. Suddenly, the screen cut to a video of Randy sitting in what appeared to be a lawyer's office. His expression was calm, almost disturbingly so, as he stared directly into the camera. Lisa froze, her eyes locked on the screen as her husband, no, ex-husband, began to speak. "You destroyed our marriage, Lisa," Randy said, his voice cold and measured. "You thought you could lie to me, betray me, and get away with it. But you were wrong." Lisa's breath caught in her throat as she watched Randy lean forward in his chair, his eyes never leaving the camera. "Now I'm going to destroy your life," he continued. "Good luck finding a job after this. I've sent this to your company. I've made sure everyone knows exactly who you are and what you've done." Tears welled up in Lisa's eyes as Randy's words cut through her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. "The house." Randy's voice was sharp, almost mocking. "It's in my name. You'll never step foot in it again. And your fancy jewelry? Gone. I sold every last piece. Consider it payment for the lies you told me." Lisa's hands shook as the tears spilled down her cheeks. She could hardly breathe, the weight of Randy's words suffocating her. "I'm done with you, Lisa," Randy said, his face hardening as he leaned back in his chair. "I won't see you again. Good luck picking up the pieces of your life. You'll need it." The video ended abruptly, leaving Lisa staring blankly at the screen. Her mother stood in stunned silence behind her, unsure of what to say. Lisa collapsed back into the chair, her body trembling as the reality of her situation sank in. Everything was gone. Her marriage, her home, her reputation. Randy had taken it all, and he had made sure she would never recover. Lisa stared at the blank screen of her laptop, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of everything she had just seen, the damning evidence, Randy's final words, left her frozen in place. Her life, as she knew it, was over. But before she could even begin to process the devastation, her phone buzzed violently in her lap. Startled, she dropped the laptop onto the coffee table and glanced at the caller ID. She already knew what was coming next. It was the police. "Hello," she answered, her voice shaking. "Is this Lisa Carter?" The voice on the other end was formal, devoid of emotion. "Yes, this is she. What's going on?" Lisa's hands trembled as she pressed the phone tighter to her ear. "Ma'am, we need you to come down to the station for questioning," the officer said. "There's been a report of corporate fraud at your company, and your name has been mentioned." Lisa's stomach dropped. "Corporate fraud? I don't understand. What does that have to do with me?" "We're not at liberty to discuss the details over the phone, but we need you to come to the station immediately," the officer replied firmly. Panic surged through Lisa. "There's been a mistake. I didn't," she stammered, but the line went cold before she could finish her sentence. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably as the reality of the situation hit her. Randy hadn't just ruined her reputation. He had gone even further. He had somehow tied her affair with George to a financial scandal at her company. "Mom, I have to go," Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible as she turned to her mother, who had been standing silently by the doorway, watching the events unfold. Her mother's face was pale, her eyes wide with concern. "Lisa, what's happening? Why are the police involved? What have you done?" "I don't know," Lisa croaked, her voice cracking. Randy, he's doing this. He's making sure I lose everything. Her mother stepped closer, reaching out to touch Lisa's arm. You need to tell me everything, Lisa. Right now. Tears welled up in Lisa's eyes as she tried to explain. It's all falling apart. The affair, the job. Randy found out. He's been planning this for months. He exposed everything at the office. And now this fraud. I don't even know how it's connected, but Randy's behind it. He's trying to destroy me. Her mother's face hardened, her usual softness replaced with anger and frustration. I told you, Lisa. I warned you about the choices you were making. And now look where it's gotten you. Lisa sobbed, her breath coming in short gasps as the enormity of the situation sank in. I didn't know it would get this bad, Mom. I thought I could handle it. Her mother shook her head. It's out of your hands now. You need to go to the police and deal with this. Whatever Randy has done, you need to face it. Lisa nodded, wiping her tears. She knew her mother was right, but the fear gnawing at her insides made her want to run and hide. She grabbed her purse, her fingers trembling as she fumbled with her keys. Her mother followed her to the door, watching as Lisa stumbled out. Call me when you know more, her mother said quietly, but there was a coldness in her voice that Lisa hadn't heard before. The drive to the station was a blur. Lisa's mind raced with every possible scenario. What had Randy done? How deep did this go? Her relationship with George had already destroyed her marriage and her career, but this was something far worse. She could feel her entire life slipping through her fingers, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. When she arrived at the station, she was greeted by two officers who led her to a small, windowless room. They asked her to sit down, and soon after, a detective walked in holding a thick file. Mrs. Carter, we're here to discuss your involvement in the ongoing investigation at your company. The detective began, his voice firm but not unkind. It seems there's a direct link between your personal relationship with Mr. George Allen and several irregularities in the company's financials. Lisa's mouth went dry. What? I don't know anything about corporate fraud. I had an affair, yes, but I didn't do anything illegal. The detective eyed her carefully. We have evidence suggesting otherwise. The transfers, the emails. It's all in here. Lisa felt like the ground was collapsing beneath her. Randy had gone so far as to frame her for financial crimes. He had made sure that not only would she lose her career, but she might also lose her freedom. I swear, I didn't do any of this, Lisa said, her voice barely above a whisper. The detective slid the file across the table, his eyes locking with hers. Then you'd better start talking. Lisa stared at the file, her heart pounding. Her nightmare had only just begun, and she had no idea how to wake up. While Lisa's world was collapsing, George's downfall had already begun. Randy had been methodical in his revenge, ensuring that George would not escape the consequences of their betrayal. It wasn't just about exposing the affair. Randy wanted to ruin George's career, his reputation, and his life completely. It started with a single email. Using the explicit photos and messages he'd collected from Lisa's phone, Randy compiled a dossier that not only proved the affair but hinted at deeper, more damaging secrets. Fraudulent deals, shady business practices, unethical transactions. Randy had dug deep into George's past and uncovered details that could not only destroy his professional life, but potentially lead to legal consequences. Randy sent the dossier anonymously to the company's board of directors. The email simply read, "Your CEO is more than just a cheater. Check the attached files and ask yourselves if he's the kind of man you want running your company." Within hours, the bombshell dropped. George was in his office when his assistant, Karen, knocked softly and entered with a strange look on her face. "George," she said, her voice cautious, "the board has called an emergency meeting. They need you in the conference room. Now." George frowned. "What's this about?" "I wasn't informed of any." "I don't know," Karen interrupted, her eyes avoiding his. "They just said it's urgent." Sensing something off, George grabbed his suit jacket and headed for the conference room, trying to shake the growing unease gnawing at him. As soon as he entered, he knew something was wrong. The board members were seated around the table, their faces grim. The air was thick with tension. "Take a seat, George," one of the senior board members said, gesturing to the empty chair at the head of the table. George sat, forcing a smile. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to sound calm. The board member at the head of the table, Mr. Dempsey, slid a file across the table. "We received some disturbing information this morning," he began. "It seems there are allegations of financial misconduct and an affair with one of your subordinates." George's blood ran cold as he opened the file. The color drained from his face when he saw the photos, intimate images of him and Lisa, along with detailed records of questionable financial dealings. There were emails he thought he had deleted long ago, transfers he believed no one had noticed. "This is ridiculous," George stammered, flipping through the pages. "Where did you get this?" "That's not important," Dempsey said, his voice icy. "What matters is that this is enough to launch a full investigation. Effective immediately, George, you're suspended. We'll be conducting an internal review of your activities, and pending the results, your position as CEO will be terminated." George stood, his voice rising in panic. "This is absurd. You can't just suspend me over anonymous accusations." But the board members exchanged cold glances. "We can and we will," Dempsey replied firmly. "There are too many discrepancies here to ignore. If these accusations are proven true, there will be legal consequences. You should prepare yourself for that." George's head spun as he realized how deep the damage was. Randy had set this trap, and he had walked right into it. The meeting ended abruptly, and George found himself walking out of the office in a daze. His world was falling apart, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket, but he ignored it until he reached his car. Finally, he checked the messages. One was from his wife, Jennifer. "I know about the affair. The kids and I are staying with my sister. Don't come home. I've already filed for divorce." George's chest tightened as he reread the message. He frantically dialed Jennifer's number, but it went straight to voicemail. He tried again. Same result. "Jennifer, please, let's talk," George said, his voice breaking as he left a voicemail. "Don't do this. Let's just talk, okay? Call me back." He hung up, slumping back in the driver's seat, staring blankly at the dashboard. His wife was leaving him. His kids were gone. His career was in shambles. He had lost everything. Days passed, and the company's internal investigation moved swiftly. The board uncovered more irregularities in the financial records, further confirming the suspicions Randy had planted. George's termination was swift, and soon, news of the scandal broke to the public. Within a week, George was a disgraced man. The media latched onto the story of a powerful CEO brought down by a mix of infidelity and corporate fraud. His reputation was ruined beyond repair. Even his closest friends began to distance themselves, not wanting to be associated with the scandal. Sitting alone in his now empty apartment, George finally understood the depth of Randy's revenge. His life, much like Lisa's, had been shattered by a few strategic moves. And as much as he tried to claw his way back, there was no escaping the consequences of his actions. George's downfall was complete. Lisa sat on the edge of her childhood bed, staring at the cluttered room she had been forced to return to. The walls were still painted the same pastel color they had been when she was a teenager, and the old posters she'd put up long ago were still tacked to the walls. The familiarity of it all should have been comforting, but now it felt like a cage. Her mother had done her best to support her, but the constant reminders of the scandal were suffocating. Lisa's old room, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The phone calls and messages from former colleagues and friends had stopped, replaced by silence and judgment. The financial strain of the scandal had made it nearly impossible for her to find a new job. Every time she went to an interview, her background check seemed to flag the scandal, and doors closed in her face. Lisa's mother knocked softly on the door, peeking her head in. "Lisa, there's a call for you. It's from a recruiter." Lisa sighed and dragged herself to the phone. "Hello, Lisa Carter?" The recruiter's voice was polite but detached. "I'm calling regarding your application for the administrative assistant position. I'm afraid we've decided to move forward with other candidates." Lisa's heart sank. "But I'm sorry, Lisa," the recruiter cut in. "We had a lot of qualified applicants. Best of luck in your job search." She hung up, feeling the weight of her failures crash down on her. Her mother entered the room and gave her a concerned look. "I'm sorry, sweetie. It's been really hard lately. But things will get better, you'll see." Lisa forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. Thanks, Mom. I just need to keep trying. Meanwhile, George had vanished. After being ousted from his position and publicly disgraced, he disappeared from the public eye. His former colleagues and friends were left to speculate about his whereabouts. Rumors swirled. Some said he had fled the country. Others believed he had retreated to a remote location to avoid the media. In reality, he had done neither. George had taken the last of his savings and went underground, trying to escape the shadow of his past mistakes. He lived in seclusion, working odd jobs under false identities to stay out of sight. In contrast, Randy had managed to turn his life around. After executing his meticulous revenge, he sold the house that had once been a symbol of his life with Lisa. He packed up his belongings and moved to a new city, determined to start over. Randy settled into a small, modern apartment in a vibrant neighborhood. He quickly adapted to his new surroundings, making friends and immersing himself in new activities. He took up painting, something he had always wanted to do but never had the time for. The pain and anger that had once consumed him began to fade, replaced by a sense of freedom and renewal. One evening, Randy sat on his new apartment's balcony, enjoying a quiet dinner. He looked out over the city skyline, a small smile playing on his lips. The weight of the past had been lifted, and he felt a genuine sense of peace. The betrayal that had once driven him to such extremes was now just a distant memory. Back at Lisa's, the days were monotonous. She spent her time applying for jobs and doing her best to stay positive, though the weight of her situation was hard to shake. Her mother continued to support her, but their strained finances made every day a struggle. Lisa's dreams of a fresh start seemed to slip further away. One day, as she walked to the mailbox to check for job offers that rarely came, she found a letter from a debt collector. She stared at the envelope, her heart sinking as she realized the extent of her financial troubles. The collector's letter demanded payment for unpaid bills, adding another layer of stress to her already dire situation. Lisa returned inside, feeling the crushing weight of her circumstances. Her mother watched her with a pained expression, unsure of how to help. As Lisa faced the aftermath of her choices and the fallout from Randy's calculated revenge, it was clear that her life, along with George's, had been irrevocably altered. While Randy moved forward and rebuilt his life, Lisa and George were left to grapple with the consequences of their actions, trying to find a way to move on from the shattered remains of their former lives. In the end, Randy had found a new beginning, leaving behind the wreckage of his past. Lisa and George, however, were left to navigate the long road of recovery, dealing with the damage they had inflicted on themselves and each other. The price of betrayal had been steep, and the path to redemption was fraught with challenges.